Water gourds are placed carefully. Someone hands out food fresh now if you're lucky. Maybe roasted fish, maybe fruit, maybe taro. The smell is comforting, like home. And the navigator sits quietly, receiving murmured thanks, quiet respect, perhaps a nod from an elder. No applause, no speeches, just the calm recognition that something important has happened. You watch them and think, sleepily, how strange it is that this kind of mastery was once treated by outsiders as myth. Because when Europeans first began sailing into the Pacific, they brought their own assumptions with them, assumptions that often dismissed indigenous knowledge as primitive or accidental. Mainstream historical fact: for centuries, many European explorers and scholars underestimated Polynesian navigational abilities, sometimes claiming that Pacific islanders drifted accidentally between islands rather than making deliberate voyages. This idea persisted for a long time. It was comfortable, because it allowed Europeans to believe that they, with their compasses and charts, were the true masters of the sea. The fire burns lower now, and the clearing feels softer, quieter, like the whole island is slowly sinking into sleep. The crew's voices have faded into murmurs. Some people lie down on woven mats. Others lean against tree trunks, letting exhaustion pull them into silence. The air is still warm, but the rain earlier has left everything smelling fresh. Wet leaves, damp soil, smoke, salt. There's a scent that feels ancient, like the island has smelled this way for 1,000 years. You sit for a moment longer, watching the last orange embers glow. Beyond the trees, the lagoon water rests quietly. Beyond the reef, the open ocean continues roaring faintly, as if it refuses to stop reminding you how large it is. And now, with land beneath you, you can finally reflect on the strange truth of this whole journey. This knowledge, the stars, swells, birds, clouds, sense and memory, almost disappeared. But it didn't, because in the modern world, Polynesian wayfinding experienced a revival. A rebirth that proved to everyone, in the most satisfying way possible, that the ancestors were not guessing. They were experts. Mainstream historical fact: the Polynesian Voyaging Society was founded in Hawaii in the 1970s, and in 1976 the double-hulled canoe Klee successfully sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using traditional navigation methods without modern instruments, guided by master navigator Mau Pielug from Satawal in Micronesia. That voyage changed everything. It wasn't just a symbolic trip. It was proof. Proof that traditional navigation could still work even in the modern era. And it was deeply emotional, because it reconnected people with knowledge that colonization and cultural disruption had nearly erased. You imagine being on Klee in 1976, surrounded by endless ocean, with no GPS, no compass, no radio guidance, just the sky and sea. And you imagine the moment land appeared, Tahiti rising from the horizon like a dream made solid. This is a Polynesian voyage, an intentional crossing of open ocean that, in the real world, stretches far beyond the distance where you can see land. Beyond the distance where your instincts start to complain. Beyond the distance where you begin bargaining with the universe. The Pacific at night feels endless. It's a dark, warm infinity with stars above and swells below. You can't tell where the sky ends and the sea begins. The horizon is more like a suggestion than a line. And somewhere near the front of the canoe, sitting as if gravity has no authority over them, is the navigator, the wayfinder. They aren't staring wildly into the dark like someone trying to read tiny print in a dim restaurant. They're calm. They look bored, almost like they're waiting for a kettle to boil. That's the first thing you notice about true expertise. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like someone quietly knowing what you don't. Polynesian wayfinding, as a real historical practice, is one of the most impressive navigational traditions on Earth. Mainstream historians agree that Polynesian sailors settled vast stretches of the Pacific, Hawaii, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, Tahiti, Samoa, Tonga, centuries before Europeans arrived with their metal tools and their habit of getting lost while claiming they discovered things. And it's not just a little impressive. It's mind-melting, because to cross that ocean you can't rely on landmarks. You can't follow a coastline. You can't look for road signs. There are no helpful gas stations. You're surrounded by blue nothingness. the kind of nothingness that makes you question your life choices. And yet, these navigators did it again and again. They didn't wander randomly and hope for the best. That's one of the major debates that has echoed through modern scholarship. For a long time, some European researchers claimed that Polynesians must have drifted accidentally to islands, carried by storms and currents like coconuts in a bathtub. But lashings, made of coconut fiber cordage called sinit in some places, allowed flexibility. Instead of snapping under stress, the canoe could bend and absorb the force of waves. It's a design philosophy that feels very Polynesian. Don't resist nature, adapt to it. Which, honestly, is a lesson you could apply to your email inbox. You look down at the lashings where the beams meet the hull. Tight, intricate knots woven like a kind of practical art. It's not sloppy rope work. It's engineering. It's architecture. It's a system. You run your fingers along one of the cords and imagine the time it took to make it. Coconut husks stripped and soaked, fibers twisted into strands, strands braided into rope. Every part of this canoe represents labor and knowledge passed down through generations. And suddenly, you're hit with the strange realization that you are sitting inside someone's cultural masterpiece. No pressure. The crew moves quietly around you. Someone checks the sail, adjusting it with the calm focus of a person who doesn't panic over minor inconveniences. Another crew member shifts a bundle of supplies, making sure it's secure. And then there are the plants. Because yes, there are plants. Polynesian voyagers famously carried what scholars sometimes call a portable garden, or canoe plants. Taro, yams, breadfruit, coconuts, bananas. They didn't just travel. They transported ecosystems. This is one of the reasons Polynesian expansion across the Pacific is considered one of humanity's greatest migration achievements. It wasn't just exploration. It was settlement. It was intentional, and it was agricultural. You can almost picture the scene. A canoe arriving at a new island, and someone proudly holding up a taro plant like, "Behold, the future carbohydrates." And you, being you, would probably ask, "Is there Wi-Fi?" The navigator, sitting toward the stern, remains quietly composed. How is that useful? And the answer is that yes, they move, but they move predictably. The night sky rotates in a dependable rhythm. Stars rise in roughly the same place each night, depending on the season. Their paths arc across the sky like slow, elegant clock hands. If you memorize enough of them, the sky becomes a calendar and a compass at once. Mainstream historians and anthropologists agree that Polynesian navigators used celestial navigation extensively, and that their knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship and oral teaching. It wasn't written down in manuals. It lived in people. Which is both beautiful and slightly terrifying because it means if your teacher is like, "You'll remember this later," you really do have to remember it later. No notes, no screenshots, just vibes and responsibility. The navigator murmurs the name of the star in their language. You don't know what it means, but you can hear the familiarity in their voice, like they're greeting an old friend. And in a way they are, because these stars aren't random lights. They're part of a system of memory that stretches back generations. You sit up slightly, squinting at the horizon. The star continues to climb. The navigator watches it carefully, then shifts their gaze to another star higher in the sky. They're comparing, measuring, confirming. It's like watching someone tune an instrument. The canoe continues forward, and you begin to notice that the navigator isn't just looking at the sky. They're looking at the relationship between the sky and the canoe. Because the canoe is moving. The horizon is moving. The swells are moving. Everything is moving. And yet, somehow, the navigator finds stability in all that motion. This is where you learn about something called the zenith star. In many navigation traditions, including Polynesian ones, certain stars pass directly overhead at specific latitudes. They're not looking for big, obvious clues. They're looking for the tiny differences most people ignore. A mainstream historical fact about Polynesian and Micronesian navigation is that training often involved long apprenticeships. Navigators didn't learn in a weekend workshop called Ocean Vibes 101. They learned for years under a master developing memory, observation, and endurance. You can't rush this kind of skill. And out here you start to understand why. Because if you blink at the wrong moment, you miss something. A star's exact rising point, a subtle shift in wind, a swell pattern, a cloud reflection. All of it matters. You glance up at the stars again. The Milky Way is still bright, and the constellations have shifted slightly since you last paid attention. They move slowly, but they do move. The navigator tracks them like they're familiar neighbors walking across the street. You try to pick a star to focus on. You choose one that seems bright enough to be trustworthy. It's low in the sky, near the horizon. You watch it. First it's steady. Then it flickers. You frown, wondering if it's moving. It isn't. The flickering is the atmosphere, air turbulence, humidity, haze. Near the horizon, stars can shimmer dramatically because you're looking through more of Earth's atmosphere. The navigator knows this. They know which stars are best for guiding, which are too dim, which are too close to the horizon to trust on a hazy night. And suddenly you feel a little humbled, because you realize you've spent your whole life thinking navigation is just knowing where north is. But out here, navigation is a constant negotiation with imperfect information. You shift your gaze downward, toward the ocean. The surface looks black, but not flat. It has texture. Ripples and tiny waves sparkle faintly in starlight. The navigator's eyes move between sky and sea. They're not just watching one system, they're watching both. Still, the swells matter because they can be consistent even when the sky is hidden. Clouds can cover stars. Rain can blur the horizon. But swells often keep rolling in the same direction for long periods, because they're generated by distant weather systems that don't change quickly. So if you learn to feel the swell direction, you can keep your canoe on course even in darkness. And you, lying there, begin to understand why navigators sometimes close their eyes. Because you can feel the swell better than you can see it. You decide to try. You close your eyes. Immediately, your brain begins to panic. Not because anything is wrong, but because modern humans don't like being deprived of visual input. It makes us feel like we've been unplugged from the universe. But you keep your eyes shut. You focus on the canoe's movement. The rise and fall is slow, but there's also a subtle sideways roll. A tilt, a gentle twist. You try to separate the motions. Up and down, side to side, forward push. It's like trying to listen to a song and pick out the bass line. And for a moment, you think you can do it. You sense a dominant swell coming from one direction, creating the main rocking pattern. Then you notice a smaller chop on top, likely caused by local wind. You open your eyes again, feeling slightly proud. The navigator, however, looks like they've been doing this since birth, which they probably have, at least culturally. Their head tilts slightly, as if they're listening to the ocean through their neck muscles. A quirky tidbit from Pacific navigation lore is the idea of the swell map, sometimes described in Micronesian contexts as attack navigation, where navigators conceptualize islands and swell patterns in a mental framework. Some accounts describe navigators imagining reference islands moving relative to the canoe, using swells as part of an internal geographic system. It's like a mental GPS, except it doesn't talk to you in a robotic voice. There's a faint lightness in one direction, almost like the darkness has been diluted. At first you think it's just your imagination, but the longer you look, the more you notice it. It's not starlight. It's something else. The navigator watches carefully. Their eyes trace the edge of a cloud bank far ahead. The clouds there look different. Taller, thicker, more piled up, like slow mountains made of vapor. You can almost see them catching moonlight, even though the moon is invisible. The navigator points, and the crew member nearest them nods, as if this is a familiar sign. You, of course, are still catching up. You squint harder, as if squinting can somehow increase your historical knowledge. It does not. But you do notice something. Some clouds are flat and stretched, like smeared paint. Others are puffier, towering upward. Some are isolated. Some are clustered. And the navigator seems to know which ones matter. Because over land, clouds often behave differently. They can form consistently above an island, especially if the island has mountains or forests that create rising warm air. Even small islands can influence cloud formation because they disrupt wind flow and release moisture. So navigators watch for cloud piles, stationary cloud formations that don't drift the same way other clouds do. And if you're sailing long enough, you learn the difference between a cloud that belongs to the ocean and a cloud that belongs to land. A quirky tidbit from Pacific voyaging lore is that some navigators could recognize certain islands by the shape of the clouds above them, almost like cloud signatures. Imagine being so familiar with your environment that you can say, "Ah yes, that's the cloud that looks like a sleepy turtle. We must be near that island." Meanwhile, you can't even recognize your own neighbor without their haircut. The canoe glides forward, and the wind shifts slightly again. The sail adjusts with a soft flap. A bird glides low over the water, barely flapping, as if it's too tired to be dramatic. It moves with purpose, cutting through the night air like a thought you can't shake. The navigator watches it, then glances at the sky again. Birds, you begin to learn, are not just land indicators. They're part of the whole system, because birds respond to wind. Birds respond to currents. Birds respond to fish, and fish respond to reefs. So following birds is like following a chain of ecological clues. It's nature's version of detective work. And unlike modern detective shows, there is no dramatic soundtrack. Just the sound of water, wind, and your own increasingly sleepy awe. A quirky tidbit from voyaging traditions is that some navigators could identify specific seabird species by the sound of their calls alone, even in the dark. Imagine being able to hear a faint squawk and instantly think, "Ah yes, that is the sooty tern. We are within 30 miles of land." Meanwhile, you hear a seagull at the beach and think, "Oh no, someone left fries unattended." You watch another bird pass, this one higher, circling slightly before continuing on. The navigator's expression remains calm, but their attention sharpens. They're reading not just the bird, but the bird's behavior. Is it flying steadily, like it knows where it's going? Is it circling like it's searching for fish? Is it returning in a straight line, like it's heading home? Because birds tell you different things depending on what they're doing. Frigate birds, for example, are famous in Pacific navigation lore. They can fly far out to sea, but they don't land on the water because their feathers aren't well suited for floating. They roost on land. So if you see a frigate bird, it can indicate land is within reach. But frigate birds can also roam very far, so you have to interpret them carefully. Terns and nadas are often more reliable, because they typically return to land at night. The navigator's gaze lifts briefly toward the wind, as if they're tasting it. Because yes, wind has flavor. Out here, the wind is information. It carries salt, moisture, and scent. It can bring hints of distant forests, lagoons, and even human smoke. You've heard stories of sailors smelling land before seeing it, and you always assumed that was a dramatic exaggeration. But now, as you breathe in, you realize it's not a myth. Subtle, but it's real. A quirky tidbit from some Pacific accounts is that navigators could identify certain islands by scent alone, recognizing the smell of specific plants or soil types carried out over the sea. Whether this is always reliable is debated, but it speaks to the incredible sensory awareness these navigators cultivated. Imagine being able to sniff the air and say, "Ah, that's definitely breadfruit and volcanic earth. We're near home." Meanwhile, you sniff the air and say, "Is that pizza?" Historians still argue whether scent could realistically travel far enough over open ocean to be a dependable navigational tool, or whether it was more of a psychological reinforcement once other cues suggested land. But out here, you can believe it at least plays a role, because the closer you get, the more the ocean feels alive. The water itself looks different. You notice subtle shifts in color even in the dark. Some patches seem slightly lighter, as if the sea is shallower. Others seem to shimmer with faint phosphorescence. You lean over the edge carefully, peering down. The canoe is still far from any reef line, but the water has changed character. And then you notice something floating by. A leaf. A single leaf, glossy and green, spinning slowly on the surface like a tiny boat of its own. You stare at it, and the sight is strangely moving. Because that leaf did not come from the middle of the ocean. That leaf came from land. Came from a tree. It came from a place where roots dig into soil. You can't even remember why you walked into a room half the time. The navigator, meanwhile, is holding an entire ocean route in their head like it's a grocery list. You imagine what that training might look like. A young apprentice sitting beside a master navigator, listening to chants night after night, learning the names of stars, learning which stars rise in which part of the horizon, learning which swell patterns mean what, learning how clouds behave near different islands, and not just learning it intellectually, learning it in the body, in the bones, in the rhythm of breathing, because oral knowledge isn't just memorized, it's performed. Chants are repeated until they become automatic, until they become part of your mind's landscape. A quirky tidbit from Polynesian and Micronesian navigation traditions is that some navigators used what could be described as memory palaces, mental structures where routes and cues were stored in an imagined sequence of locations. Sometimes these were linked to actual islands, sometimes to symbolic imagery. This isn't unique to Polynesia. Of course, memory palaces have been used in many cultures, but it's especially powerful here because the navigator is literally traveling through space while mentally traveling through remembered sequences. It's like your brain is sailing alongside your body. And as you think about this, you realize something. Wayfinding is not just about the ocean. It's about storytelling. Because a chant can encode a route. A myth can encode a star's behavior. A genealogy can encode historical migration paths. A song can encode the timing of winds and seasons. The navigator's culture is a library, and the canoe is a moving bookshelf. Historians still argue whether navigational chants were primarily practical teaching tools, or also served ceremonial and spiritual purposes beyond navigation. You imagine long nights of training, being corrected, being tested, being forced to memorize star sequences until they could recite them while half asleep. Because out here, you might need to recite them while half asleep. The navigator makes a small gesture, and a crew member adjusts the sail slightly. Another shifts weight on the platform to balance the canoe. No one argues. No one complains. You try to picture yourself in this crew. You would absolutely complain. You'd be like, so, how many more hours until land? Because my knees have filed a formal complaint. And the crew would probably respond by politely ignoring you, which is honestly the correct response. The navigator looks up at the sky again, then down at the sea. Their eyes flick toward the horizon, where the clouds are piled thick and heavy. They are still cross-checking. Even now, even when land is near, because the closer you get to land, the more dangerous things become. Out in the open ocean, you can drift a little. You can correct slowly. But near reefs, mistakes become sharp and immediate. So the navigator's calm becomes even more important. This is where the spiritual side of the navigator's role becomes clearer. In many Polynesian traditions, navigation was not separated from religion or ritual. The sea was inhabited by gods, spirits, ancestors. The canoe was not just wood. It was lineage. It was identity. So the navigator's authority often carried a sacred dimension. They might perform rituals before departure. They might observe taboos during the voyage. They might speak certain chants to protect the canoe and crew. A quirky tidbit. In some Pacific traditions, there were strict rules about behavior on a voyaging canoe. No arguing, no careless speech, no disrespect toward the sea. Sometimes even bodily functions were regulated with careful etiquette. Imagine being told, "Please be respectful when you pee over the side. The ocean is listening." It's funny, but also deeply human. Someone passes around a small bundle of food, dried fish, perhaps, or pieces of dried fruit. It's not glamorous. It's not a charcuterie board. It's survival food. Mainstream historical fact: voyagers carried preserved foods such as dried fish, fermented breadfruit paste, coconuts, and other durable supplies, and they relied on fishing during voyages to supplement their diet. You accept a small piece of food and chew slowly. It's salty, tough, and oddly comforting. Tastes like effort, like patience. And suddenly, you realize that daily life on a canoe isn't dramatic all the time. It's routine. It's boredom. It's discomfort. The small moments of laughter and frustration. And the navigator, despite their sacred authority, is also human. They get tired. They get hungry. They get sunburned. They just happen to do it with more dignity than you ever could. The crew settles into a quiet rhythm. Paddle, rest, paddle, rest. The sound of paddles dipping into water is soothing, like slow percussion. You look around and notice the small details of life aboard. A woven basket tucked near someone's feet. A gourd tied securely with rope. A fishing line coiled carefully. A small bundle of leaves used as wrapping. Everything is functional. Everything is minimal. Nothing is wasted. And you realize how different this is from modern travel. When you travel now, you bring extra shoes, extra chargers, extra outfits for hypothetical scenarios. Here, everything has a purpose. Even your body position matters. You shift slightly and the canoe rocks, and someone gives you a look. Not angry, just gently concerned. The look says, "Please stop existing so loudly." You freeze, trying to become part of the furniture. A quirky tidbit. On long voyages, personal hygiene was creative. There are accounts suggesting that sailors used seawater to wash, and that fresh water was rationed carefully. Sun protection could involve coconut oil, plant pastes, or simply staying covered, which is not what you want when you're trying to steer a canoe full of tired people and fermented breadfruit. The navigator's eyes narrow. They watch the cloud edges, looking for movement. They listen to the wind, feeling it on their skin. They glance at the water surface, watching for texture changes that signal wind shifts. This is the improvisation part of navigation, because the stars can be steady and the swells can be predictable, but storms are wild. And out here, wild is not fun. The crew begins securing things again. Someone ties down a basket. Another checks lashings. The canoe is already well organized, but storms demand extra caution. You watch them move, and you realize how practiced they are. No one is panicking. No one is yelling. Everyone is doing their job like they've done it 100 times. Because they probably have. The wind strengthens slightly. The palm leaves on shore, barely visible in the darkness, rustle louder. You can't see the trees clearly, but you can hear them, like the island is whispering to itself. The navigator gestures, and the crew begins paddling more deliberately toward a sheltered landing spot. The lagoon water is calm, but the wind is building. You can feel the canoe responding to gusts now, drifting slightly off course unless corrected. And here, the navigator's calm becomes even more impressive. Because if you were in charge, you'd already be screaming internally. You'd be like, okay, so, the wind is doing weird things, and the clouds look angry, and I'm pretty sure that bird just judged me. But the navigator doesn't panic. They adjust. They work with the wind